I. There is a particular silence that falls in a great room when a name is spoken that no one wishes to own. It is not the silence of an empty place. It is the silence of 200 people all at once deciding not to hear. The assembly rooms at Marchmore were the finest in the county, long and bright and gilded, made for the kind of evening when the whole of good society came to look at itself in the glass and be pleased. On such nights, the candlelight was kind to everyone. It doubled in the tall mirrors. The music carried the length of the floor, and beneath all of it ran the quiet, endless labor that such gatherings are truly for, the sorting of who belongs from who does not. A room like that can weigh a person in a single glance. It reads the cut of a sleeve, the ease of a step, the way a woman carries her head when she believes she has a right to be looked at. It settles the question of her long before she has crossed the floor, and once it has settled, the whole room knows the verdict without a word being passed. And on this night, in the middle of the brightest room in the county, the verdict had gone against the woman by the far windows. She stood very straight in gray silk, alone in a widening ring of empty floor, while the crowd drew back from her the way the tide draws off a stone. No one touched her. No one spoke to her. Then a voice near the card table said softly, the 3 words the whole room had been thinking, "You are no Duchess." The woman did not turn toward the voice. She had learned in a harder school than this that to turn was to hand the speaker what he wanted, proof the words had struck home. So she kept her eyes on the black window glass where the bright room hung reflected behind her, every face turned her way, and let the 3 words stand in the air, unanswered. The name she carried now was Verity, Duchess of Wayland. She had worn it a little more than a year. She had signed it in the register of a small gray church, in her own steady hand, while a tall, silent man she scarcely knew stood at her shoulder, and the vicar had married them so quickly he might have been ashamed to be seen doing it. A year of that name, and still the county would not say it aloud. They called her the Wayland woman when they were careful, and coarser things when they were not. The marriage, they agreed, was a trap she had sprung, for no duke stooped so far of his free will, and they wondered, in the gentle voices people keep for cruelty, what hold a creature like her had over a man like him. Verity heard all of it. She had grown a hide against such talk in the 2 ruined years before her wedding. Her father had been a builder, and he had taught her that a thing made true holds its shape under load and does not care who leans on it. So she held herself true. She kept her spine straight and her hands still, and inside her glove she closed 2 fingers on the small brass weight she carried everywhere, a builder's plumb bob, worn smooth, the last thing of her father's left to her. It hung always the same way, straight down, the one thing in her life that had never once lied to her. What she did not do, what the whole room stood waiting for and did not get, was deny the charge. That was the strange part, the part they would turn over for weeks. A wronged lady protests. She flushes, she draws herself up, she demands to know how they dare. The Duchess of Wayland only stood and let the 3 words hang, and said not one word in her own defense, as though somewhere beneath all that stillness a part of her believed them true, and her husband, the one man alive who might have crossed that floor and answered for her, was not in the room. The Duke of Wayland did not come to such nights, and had he come, every soul present knew the truth of him. Whatever was said of the Duke, to his face, or behind his hand, the Duke of Wayland never answered it. To see why 3 words from a stranger could take her apart, you have to go back 7 years. To the summer, the gallery came down. Verity had been 17. Her father was Elias Ansell, a master builder of Marchmore, a plain, exact, unhurried man who had raised half the good houses in the district and had never been known to cut a corner or soften a figure. He built the way careful men keep faith, quietly, with no one watching. He had a saying his daughter heard so often, she still heard it in her sleep. A wall does not care what you meant by it. It only stands, or it does not. The great new assembly rooms had been the finest thing he ever made. Their pride was a long upper gallery of iron and glass, light as a promise, built to hold the whole of Marchmore on a gala night. On the first such night, with the gallery full and the music playing beneath it, the iron gave way, and the gallery came down into the crowd below. Lives were lost that night. A town that had cheered the building now wept and raged and wanted a name to pin the horror to, and blame ran downhill as blame will to the man whose seal was on the plans. They said Elias Ansell had bought cheap iron and kept the difference for himself. They said the castings were thin, the metal false, the accounts cooked to bury it. And there were papers that seemed to say so, an order for inferior iron under his own seal, ledgers altered to match. He stood in a paneled room before the men of law and said, in a voice his daughter had never heard from him, that he had never once ordered a bad casting or falsified a figure, that the iron in his drawings was sound, that some other hand had swapped the metal after and left his name to answer for the dead. Not one person of weight rose to say the same. He was ruined inside a season. He lost the yard, the house, and the good name of 30 honest years, and 2 winters later he was dead. And though the doctor wrote some careful word on the paper, every soul in Marchmore knew he had died of the disgrace, the way a beam gives way under a weight it was never built to carry. Verity had never doubted him for an hour, then or since. It changed nothing. A daughter's word was worth little in a court, and less than that in a town that had already chosen what to believe. She went from the builder's warm parlor to nothing at all in the space of 2 years, and learned in that long fall every hard lesson the world keeps ready for the children of ruined men. But there was one thing about the night the gallery fell that she had never told to a living soul, not to the magistrates who questioned her, not to her father through the 2 slow winters of his dying, not, in the whole strange quiet year of her marriage, to the Duke of Wayland himself. She had been there that night, and she had seen something no one else had seen. And it was the one thing that might have changed everything, if only she had dared to speak it. By the end of the 2nd year, the world had worn Verity down to a single room and a single skill. The room sat over a print seller's shop in a mean quarter of Marchmore, cold in a way that got into the bone. The skill was her father's. She could draw. She had stood at his elbow since she was old enough to hold a pencil, and she had his hand for a true line, so she kept herself alive by the one trade her name could not spoil, copying plans and coloring cheap engravings for a man named Prentice, who sold them dear and paid her next to nothing. Prentice knew who she was, which was the whole reason he paid her what he did. A woman who cannot say her own name aloud in a shop cannot argue the price of her labor, and he made sure she never forgot he knew it. She took the coin because the coin was bread. She had learned by then that pride and bread rarely sit at one table, and that when they will not, it is pride you learn to go without. It was into that room on a raw evening near the turn of the year that the Duke of Wayland came. She did not know him at first, only that a tall man in a plain dark greatcoat stooped beneath her low doorway, bringing the cold in with him, and something else besides, a great stillness, as though the noise of the street had been shut off at his back. He looked at the drawings pinned to her wall, the careful copied fronts, the ruled and lettered lines, a long while, before he turned and looked at her. Then he gave her his name, and told her he had come to ask her to be his wife. He said it, as another man might say the hour, with no warmth and no unkindness, only a plain thing set on the table between them. Verity, who had been insulted in 100 fashions across 2 years, found she had no answer at all. She thought first that it was a cruel joke, then that it was a madness, then some trap too tired to make out the shape of. Why, she said at last. It was the only word she owned. He did not answer it. She would come to know that silence well, the door that shut without a sound on certain questions. He said instead that she would have his name and his protection, and a roof that was hers, that she need not feign for him any feeling she did not hold, and that he asked of her nothing she need ever be ashamed to give. The name of Wayland, he said, was worth something yet, even to a woman the world had thrown out, and it was hers if she would take it. Everything in her hard 2 years told her to distrust it. A gift with no price named is only a price not yet spoken, and this was no small gift. This was a duke, and dukes do not wed ruined girls for the goodness of their hearts. She knew, as all the county knew, the things that were said of this one. He was the man who never gave the world an answer. Let a slander be laid at his door, and he let it lie there. Let a lie be carried of him to every table in the shire, and he would sit at the head of his own, and not trouble to deny a word of it. Some named it pride, the scorn of a man too high to explain himself. Some named it guilt, and said a man who will not defend himself has nothing worth defending. And some said, dropping their voices, that there was a stain on the house of Wayland, an old dark business of a loss some years gone, and that his silence was the silence of a man afraid of what his own mouth might loose. Verity looked at the shut, still face across her cold little room, and understood that the hand held out to save her belonged to a man the better part of the world took for a monster. And yet, when he had said the name was worth something even to a castaway like her, he had not said it as men say, a kindness they mean to be thanked for. He had said it as a man names a debt he intends to pay. And once, only once, when his gaze went back to the drawings on her wall, to the true ruled lines in her father's hand that were now her own, something crossed, that closed face that she could put no name to, and that belonged to no story of pride or scorn. It was gone before she could take hold of it, but she had seen it, and a woman with nothing left will follow the smallest true thing a long way into the dark. So she said yes. She went with him not knowing, and would not learn for a long while, that the Duke of Wayland had not come to her cold room by any chance, and that the reason he could not speak was bound fast to the very ruin that had cost her all she had. They were married inside the month in the small grey church, and Marchmore had its first scandal of the new year before the register was dry. Verity found she did not care what Marchmore thought on the morning she left it. She cared only that the north road bore her away from the print-seller's cold room and from Prentice's small knowing eyes into country she had never seen. Fenwick lay 2 days off in a green-folded county of low hills and old woods, the seat of the Waylands past any date a man could set to it. She braced for it the whole way. She knew what a great house made of a woman like her. She had felt the fine houses of Marchmore close against the builder's daughter, and she reasoned a duke's house would be colder than any of them. A shut grand thing full of servants who would know to the inch what she was. She set her face for it, and swore she would give them nothing to feed upon. What she saw from the carriage window in the last hour undid her guard before ever she reached the door. She had expected a dead place. What she found was a place being made. All down the last green valley, the estate was at work. On new thatch lay bright on a row of cottages, and a mason's scaffold stood clean against a barn end, the fresh courses laid true and plumb as a copybook. A stone bridge over the beck had been lately rebuilt, its mortar still pale. A mill wheel turned new and square in its race. Everywhere. She looked some broken thing had been set right, and set right well, by a hand that plainly knew the difference between work that will stand and work that only looks as though it might. Verity had been raised inside that difference. It was the whole of her father's religion. To come out of 2 years of ruin and meet it here in a stranger's valley, laid under the low winter light like a language she had thought never to be spoken in again, moved her in a way she was not ready for and could not hide quickly enough. The house itself, when they came to it, was old and kindly worn and full of light against the early dark. But it was the valley she carried in with her, the plumb wall and the square wheel and the true laid stone, and the strange dawning thought quickly pushed under, that whatever the world might say of the man beside her, the man beside her mended things. She was met at the door not by a rank of liveried scorn, but by a small, brisk, elderly woman with flour to her wrists, who caught Verity's frozen hands between her own and rubbed the cold out of them there on the step, scolding the weather and the length of the road and the thinness of her cloak, all in one breath, and never once by so much as a flicker. Letting on there was anything unusual in a duchess who came with one small trunk and a face, braced to be struck. Mrs. Amory had kept Fenwick 40 years. She had raised the Duke and his sister and the brother they had lost from the nursery upward, after their mother died young. Whatever the county had decided of the new Duchess had plainly not been suffered past the gates, and Verity had the sudden odd sense, following the round bustling figure up the shallow old stairs, of having stepped inside a wall the world's talk did not get over. The room made ready for her was not the great state chamber she had steeled herself against, all cold brocade and painted dukes glaring down. It was a smaller room at the south end, where the sun came warm already, with a good fire, and in the deep window bay, set square in the best of the light, stood a plain broad table that she understood at a single glance. On it lay a fresh block of drawing paper, a case of instruments, well used and carefully kept, pencils, a straight rule, a sloped board tilted to the very angle a hand wants for fine work. No one at Fenwick had asked her whether she drew. She had told no one on the road. It was tradesman's skill, a builder's skill, the very thing her ruined name was ruined for, and no part of what a duchess was meant to be. Yet someone had known, and had gone ahead of her into this room, and set out in the kindest light, the one thing in all the world that had ever made her feel she was still herself. She kept her voice level, and asked Mrs. Amory whose doing it was. The old woman looked at her a moment, and some tenderness moved beneath the brisk face. "His Grace," she said. He had the table carried up himself and stood over the setting of it, and had the light judged for the hour you were looked for, and he gave no reason, which is his way. He is a great one for the doing, and no one at all for the telling. You will grow used to it, or you will not. Most of us have. Then she promised that supper would wait upon Verity's pleasure and not the other way about, and went out, and left the new Duchess of Wayland standing between a lit fire and a drawing table, unable to account for either. She had come to Fenwick certain that so much ease must hide a reckoning somewhere in it. 2 years had taught her to read a kindness the way her father read cheap work, running an eye along it, for the papered-over seam, the buried fault that comes through and shows itself one hard night when you have trusted your way to it. So she searched this for its fault. She watched her husband across the few quiet meals they shared and waited for the courtesy to turn and hand her its true price. The price did not come. Weeks went by, and it did not come, and its not coming disturbed her far more than any demand could have, for a debt has a shape a person can set herself against, and this had no shape she could anywhere find. It was the sister who unsettled her most, because the sister neither warmed to her nor cut her, and Verity, who could read most rooms, could not read Lady Clemence at all. The Duke's sister lived at Fenwick, a widow some few years the elder of the two, tall and still like her brother, but without his silence. Where he withheld his words, she spent hers exactly, and never one over the mark. For some days, she only watched the new Duchess with a long, level, unhurried look, the way one watches a stranger let loose in a house one loves, waiting to see what the stranger will break. On the third day she spoke, over the tea, with no run-up to it at all. "You want to know why he married you," she said. "You would be a fool not to. And you are not a fool, I think. I will give you the piece that is mine. For 7 years, I have watched my brother carry a thing alone that has slowly turned him to stone, and when he told me he meant to make you his wife, I did not stand in his path, though I could have, and did not understand him. Why he chose you and what he intends by it is his to tell and not mine. I will only warn you that he may never tell it, My brother would sooner shift a hill with a spoon than speak aloud a thing that cost him. She set the cup down without a sound. As to whether I shall like you, I have not yet decided. But you have not whined, and you have not fawned, and you looked at that drawing table as though someone had handed you back your own name. So I find I am willing to wait and see. From me, that is a warm welcome. Do not look for a warmer. And she would say no more. She turned the talk to the roads and the hard winter and a neighbor's gout, and Verity understood that she had run up against the same shut door in the sister as in the brother, and that behind it, somewhere in this kind, strange house of well-mended things, waited the whole reason she had been brought here. We will pause here just a moment. If this story has taken hold of you, take a second to subscribe so the next part finds its way to you, and then stay close. Because what Verity is about to learn of her silent husband will change everything she thinks she knows. The first true understanding Verity had of her husband, she came to without a word from him, in the way she came to understand everything at Fenwick in those early weeks, by watching what he did with his hands. She had married, the county believed, a cold, idle duke, who sat upon his silence like a toad on a stone. The truth was the plain opposite. Alaric of Wayland worked, the way other men breathe, from first light, mostly out of doors, at the mending of broken things. He walked his land before the household woke, and where a thing was failing, he set it right himself, in old clothes, with his own tools, beside his men, and not above them. She saw the manner of him one raw morning in her 3rd week. There was trouble at the far barn. A length of new wall raised by a young mason. A boy really hurrying to beat the frost had gone up out of True, and part of it had slumped in the night, a heavier fall, only a question of time. The head mason had the boy by the collar and was shaming him before the others in the way that ends with a man turned off without a character, and a walled boy turned off in winter is a boy who does not eat. The Duke came into the yard, and the shouting stopped, for all of them knew the master for a hard man and looked now for a hard judgment. He gave none. He looked at the leaning wall a long moment, then he took off his coat. He did not scold the boy, and he did not spare him either. He set the boy to pulling the bad courses down stone by stone, and pulled beside him, and when the ground was clear he took up the line and the level, and showed the boy without heat, and with few words, how you lay the first course dead. True, so every course above has no choice but to be true, and how a wall built honest at its foot will carry near anything, while one built false betrays you the first hard night for all it looks fair by day. They built it back together, the Duke and the boy, and the Duke said to the head mason only that the boy was to stay, and be taught properly this time, and that the new wall was his own to keep in repair for a 12-month, so he might learn what it costs to make a thing last. Then he put his coat on again and went in. Verity watched the whole of it from the barn door and did not know what to do with any part of it. She had come braced to fear this man. She had not been ready to see him kneel in the frozen mud beside a frightened boy and teach him her own father's gospel, that a thing is either built true or it is not, in very nearly her father's own words, and never once glance up to see whether anyone marked him doing it. It was on one of Lady Clemence's errands to the village, a week or two after, that Verity came upon the other kind of thing her husband did, the kind he took even greater pains that no one should trace to him. She had gone to carry broth to an old woman named Sennet, at the lane's end. The woman was near blind and glad of a voice, and talked while Verity sodded the fire, and what she talked of was the great grief of her life. She had had a daughter once, she said a good girl in service in a spa town some way off, who had gone up with her mistress to a fine new gallery on a gala night, and the gallery had come down, and her girl had never come home again. Verity sat very still on the low stool with the broth going cold in her hands. Marchmore, the old woman said, and all but spat the name. Built by a rogue that cheated on the iron to fatten his own purse and let a roomful of folk come to grief for it, and died in his bed, they say, sooner than answer for it. Ansel? She said it the way you say a curse worn smooth, with long saying. Verity Ansell, who had loved that man past all the world's proof, sat in a stranger's cottage and heard her father condemned by a woman he had never met and could no longer answer for himself, and did not trust her own voice enough to make a sound. But that was not all old Senate had to tell. For when her girl was lost, she said, and she herself grown too old and blind to work, she had waited to be carried off to the workhouse, there being nothing else for such as her. The workhouse had not come. What had come, that first hard winter and every winter since, was money. A little each quarter, enough for coal and broth and to keep her own roof over her own head, brought by a lawyer who would say only that it came from a fund made for those the Marchmore Gallery had harmed, and would name no giver. However, she begged. A fund, the old woman said, and her blind eyes filled. There is no fund I ever heard of that keeps an old blind woman off the parish year upon year, and asks not a farthing, nor a thank you back. Somebody does it. Somebody with a herd of their own bound up in it, I have always thought. For the open-handed give and are gone, while this one gives and hides. I bless them every night of my life with no name to bless, which is the only manner of praying they have left me. Verity walked back to Fenwick through the cold, with the empty bowl in her hands and her mind gone entirely quiet. She began, after that, to see it everywhere. It ran beneath the estate's open accounts, quiet and hidden, and when Verity drew the threads together, they all ran back to the one place. Every soul that secret money reached had been broken. One way or another, by the night the Marchmore Gallery came down. She had believed herself the only creature living who carried that night as a private wound. She understood now that she was only one of a scattered company, all of them tended in the dark, and that at the hidden heart of it, seeing to them all and forbidding every one of them the relief of thanking him, stood the last man in England she would ever have named. Her own husband, who had never once in her hearing spoken the name of the gallery or the builder or the dead, and who guarded his tie to that far-off ruin more closely than anything he owned. Their own strange friendship, if a thing so wordless could be given the name, began over work, because work was the one tongue they both spoke without labor. He came upon her drawing one gray afternoon, and instead of the apology or retreat she looked for, he stood and studied what was on her board, the front of a house she had loved as a child, drawn from memory. He looked at it the way a man does who knows what he is seeing, and then he said, the longest string of words she had yet had of him, that her line was truer than most men's. He had paid good money for, and asked her, plainly as one workman asks another, whether she would look over something of his. He brought her the plans for a row of almshouses he meant to raise in the village. She found the fault in them inside a minute, a stair too mean for the traffic he wished to send through it, and she told him so, flatly, because he had asked her as a workman, and it would have been an insult to answer him as a duke. He did not color, and he did not stiffen. He looked where her pencil pointed, saw that she was right, and changed it, and something in the plain justice of that, the silent duke, taking a correction from the disgraced builder's daughter, as though the one thing that mattered was whether the stair was sound, loosed a knot in her that 2 years of ruin had drawn tight. After that they worked. She did not think, looking back, that either of them had ever chosen it. It simply became the shape of their days. She drew, and he built, and between them, things got made that would stand. He spoke more at the drawing board than anywhere else, though even there not much, and what he said was always the thing that mattered, and never the thing that did not. The silences between were not empty ones. No silence in her life had ever sat so lightly on her as the silences she kept with him. There was one room at Fenwick she had never been into, a plain door off the estate office that was always kept locked. She had thought nothing of it, a strong room for papers and plate, until the afternoon she carried a finished drawing down to leave for him, and found the plain door standing open, and her husband within, and stopped upon the threshold before he heard her. It was no strong room. It was a working room, and every inch of it was given over to one thing. Drawings were pinned across one whole wall, and even upside down and across the room. Verity knew the hand that had made them, knew it as she knew her own, because it was her father's. Ledgers stood squared on a table, and letters lay weighted flat, and along the sill, like specimens in a museum, ran a line of iron castings, some sound, some cracked clean through, each with a paper tag tied to it, and lettered in her husband's own precise hand. She must have made some small sound, for he turned. For the space of one breath, she saw his face with nothing drawn across it, and what stood in it was not anger at being found. It was nearer to the look of a man caught partway through a thing he has carried alone so long that he no longer knows how to be seen carrying it. Then the shutter came down, as it always came down. He crossed the room without haste and drew the door quietly to behind him, so gently that it was not a rebuke, and said only that it was a state business, and no fit thing to trouble her with, in a voice that told her plainly the matter was closed, and the door with it. But she had seen. She had seen her dead father's drawings on a duke's wall, and the broken iron laid out like evidence, and a locked room, at the heart of a silent house, given over wholly to the ruin that had destroyed her family. And though she did not yet grasp the shape of it, she understood this much. Standing in the cold office, with her own forgotten drawings still in her hand, whatever her husband was and whatever he had married her for, it was not the thing any of them said. And it was bound, root and branch, to the night the gallery fell. The spring came on, and with it the visitors. For a duke, newly and scandalously married, is a thing a county must come and look at for itself. They called at Fenwick in 2s and 3s on the pretense of seeing Lady Clements, and studied Verity the way you study a picture you have been told is a forgery, hunting for the false brushstroke that gives it away. She had borne worse. She poured the tea and said little, and let them find nothing, and mostly they went away baffled, which she counted a small victory. It was a Mrs. Harkness who went too far. She was a large, comfortable woman with a soft voice and hard eyes, a great gatherer and dealer in other people's ruin, and she had come chiefly to carry some piece of the Duke home with her. She worked around to it over the second cup, in the cozy way of her kind. Of course, she said, one does hear such things of his grace, that quietness of his. It is not a natural thing in a grown man. My own husband holds that a fellow who will not answer for himself has, as a rule, some reason he dare not give. And that old business, the death in the family, so many years back, so very never accounted for. She let the words settle, and smiled, waiting for the young wife to flinch. Verity put down her cup. She had had no intention of speaking. The words came before she had chosen them. "Your husband is wrong," she said. "I have kept house here some months now. I have watched my husband go out before light in the frost to raise a boy's fallen wall with his own hands, sooner than see the boy turned off to starve. I have watched him mend what other men would let fall, and take not one grain of credit for it, and forbid the thanks that were his due. That is not the silence of a man with a thing he dare not say. It is the silence of a man who decided long ago that words are the cheapest thing he owns, and deeds the dearest, and has spent himself only in the dear coin ever since. I wish there were more men like him in the world, and fewer who sip their tea and pity a better man than themselves." The room went very quiet. Mrs. Harkness's soft face set hard. Across the hearth, Lady Clements bent lower over her needlework, and the small sound she made was not entirely a cough. Verity, with her pulse loud in her own ears, knew two things together. She had shamed a guest at her own hearth, and she was not sorry, and would do it again inside the hour. She did not know then that it would reach him. Little happened at Fenwick that did not in time reach him. That evening she found left on her drawing table a single line in his precise upright hand on a scrap of good paper. "Mrs. Harkness was not worth a moment of your trouble," it said. "I am grateful all the same." She kept the scrap, for a man who spent his words as dearly as this one did not set down the word grateful, without meaning the whole weight of it. What she could not know was what the defending of him had done inside the man himself. He had the account of it from Clemens told dryly, and afterward he went out and walked his dark land far longer than his walking ever took him. For 7 years he had held to one plain hard rule, that his word did harm when he loosed it, and that the only safe part of a man was his hands. He had built the rule from the wreck of everything and lived inside it, and it had kept him upright. And now a ruined girl he had married for a debt to the dead had stood in his own drawing room and done for him without knowing it, the very thing that doing it had once destroyed him for. She had spoken for him into a hostile room. And the roof had not come down. The world had not ended. A woman had said a true thing in his defense and walked out of the room unbroken. He stood in the cold field and felt, for the first time in 7 years, the wall he had built around his own tongue shift a little on its footing, the way a wall shifts in the first thaw when the ground beneath it wakes. It frightened him worse than any accusation ever had, for he knew, in the place where a man keeps the truths he tells no one, that he was beginning to want to speak again. And the last time he had wanted that, with the whole of his young heart, the world had shown him without mercy exactly what a word of his was worth. It was Lady Clemens who told her in the end, or told her the half of it, that was hers to tell. It was a hard, bright morning, late in the spring. The sister had been short all that week, watching Verity across the rooms with something working behind her level eyes, and at last, over the cold ends of breakfast with the servants sent out, she set down her cup and said, "You are eating yourself hollow trying to understand my brother, and a person who acts in the dark mostly acts wrong. I would rather you acted in the light even if you still act wrong. So I am going to break a promise. I am too old and too fond of you both to keep it any longer." She told it plainly, the way she did everything. "You know, a gallery fell at Marchmoor 7 years ago and a whole roomful of people were lost," she said. "You know it better than most. What you do not know is that my brother was in that room and did not come out of it whole, though he walked out on his own 2 feet, which is more than many did." Verity had gone very still. "He was 22, Clemens said, "and he was not the man you know. He talked, my dear, he laughed. He believed, the way the young do, that the world was mostly reasonable, and that a true thing said plainly would be heard. He had a passion for building, for the new iron, for the daring of it, and he went to Marchmoor for the gala with our younger brother beside him. Kit was 18. Alaric brought him for a treat. She was quiet a moment. Kit was beneath the gallery when it came down. Alaric was not. That is the whole difference between the brother I have and the brother I buried. A matter of where 2 young men stood when the iron gave way." The bright room seemed to Verity to have gone cold. "He did not run mad with grief," Clemence went on, "though it might have been kinder if he had. He did a colder thing. He went down into the wreck while they were still bringing people out, and he looked at the broken iron with the eye of a man who had studied such things for the love of them, and he saw in a moment what the coroner took months to be argued into never seeing at all. The castings that failed were not the castings your father drew for. They were cheap, and they were wrong, and they had been set in the place of good ones by somebody who stood to pocket the difference. My brother knew it standing in the rubble with Kit not yet carried out. He knew your father had been robbed, and was about to be condemned for the robbing. So when the inquiry sat, weeks after, he did the thing he had been raised to do. He stood up before every person of weight in that county and said what he had seen. He named your father innocent, and named the man he believed had done it, who had supplied the iron and swapped it and forged the orders to carry the blame. He named Sir Osric Vane. The name dropped into the bright room like a stone into still water. "You will guess how it went," Clemence said, and her voice was steady and terrible. Vane was already rising, rich, open-handed, a friend to every good cause, the sort of man a county loves, and here was a wild, grieving boy of 22, with no proof but his own eye and his own certainty, accusing that great man over the bodies of the dead. They did not merely disbelieve him. They pitied him, which was worse, and then they used him. Vane's friends put it about that the poor young lord had lost his wits with grief, flailing for someone to blame because he could not bear that he had led his own brother to his death, and some the cruelest turned it the other way, and whispered that the Waylands had had a hand in the building and were shouting to cover their own guilt, that there was a stain on our house. You have heard that last one for yourself. It began that day. And your father, Clement said more gently. My brother standing up did not save him. It sank him deeper. For now the only man who spoke for Elias Ansel was a discredited boy that County was laughing at. And your father's guilt looked the surer for so mad a champion. Alaric has never forgiven himself for that. He said what was true with everything in him, and the saying of it helped to ruin an innocent man and shame his own dead brother in a single breath. A thing like that does not teach a man to be careful. It unmakes him. She folded her hands. He stopped talking. Not all at once, but within the year, and then all together in any way that counts. Why, he decided, his word was a loaded thing that went off in his hand and struck whoever he aimed it at, and that the only trustworthy part of a man was his hands, his money, his patience. So, for 7 years, he has used those. He has gathered quietly, in the one way he still trusts, the proof he did not have as a boy, and he has kept alive in secret. Every family that night broke, because he could not bear that they should go under while he waited. You have met a few of them. Verity thought of old Senate blessing a nameless giver in the dark. Yes, she said. Her voice did not sound like her own. I have met a few of them. And when he learned, Clement said, that Ansel's daughter had been thrown on the world and refused at every honest door, he did the first thing such a man can do. He gave you the one shelter no slander could quite reach, his own name. That is why you are here. Not for a companion, not for a wife, whatever the church wrote in its book. For a debt he has carried 7 years and cannot set down. There, now you have it. She rose and gathered her work-basket and stopped at the door without looking round. I will tell you the one thing I do not know, she said, since I have told you all the rest. I do not know where he went in the fortnight after we buried Kit, before he stood up at the inquiry and ruined himself. He went off alone and came back harder and more certain, and he has never once told me where, and I have never asked. It is the single door in him I have never opened. She paused. I think, perhaps, it is yours to open, if it is any living soul's, and she went out. Verity sat alone a long while after the door had closed, and let the knowing settle into her like cold water finding the low places. She understood it all now. The fire and the drawing table judged to the very hour. The pains he took that no gift of his should ever be traced home. The locked room, the broken iron, her father's hand pinned to a duke's wall. She understood the silence itself, a young man who had once said what was true with all that was in him, and been forced to watch it help destroy an innocent man, and had closed his mouth against the whole world for 7 years, rather than chance it again. And she understood, with a pain that stopped her breath, what it meant for her. Every kindness of that strange winter and spring had not been for her at all. It had been for a dead man, and a debt, and the peace of an old guilt. He had married her the way another man lays a wreath, out of duty to the gone, and had never imagined she might weigh with him as herself. And she knew, sitting there, that she had gone and given her whole heart to the one man in England, bound not to want it. That was the folly Clemens had watched approaching. For a proud woman it was a hard mouthful. For a day, she thought, the only bearable course was to take the shelter, ask nothing, and let her heart go quietly hungry. Then she thought of the fortnight Clemens could not account for, the one door in him no one had ever opened. And she thought of the things she herself had carried since she was 17 and never dared to speak. And something in her straightened, the way a dropped line straightens and hangs true. She had come to Fenwick to be kept, she saw. Now she had been handed instead the one thing a woman in her place never looks to be given twice, a thing to give that lay in no hands but her own. She could open the shut door in him, and she carried, locked in her own chest, the very piece his 7 patient years still lacked. She would not go small and hungry. She would give him both, his voice and her hidden truth, not as a debt paid, but as the one free gift still left in her keeping. She did not yet know it would cost her everything first. The happiest night of that whole strange year and the night it all broke were one and the same. The rains came hard at the end of a wet autumn, and the beck below the new stone bridge rose in the dark past anything the oldest man on the estate had seen. Word came up to the house near midnight that the bridge was taking the flood badly, and the almshouses on the low ground would go if the water was not turned. Alaric was out of the door before the man had finished, and Verity, who could no more have stayed behind than stopped breathing, went with him. They worked till dawn. In the roaring wet, the whole estate turned out with lanterns, packing the bank, shoring the piers, cutting a channel to carry the worst of the water wide of the cottages. Verity labored beside her husband, in the mud and the din, and found she knew what to do, because it was her father's work, the reading of water and load, and the true line of a thing under strain. Twice she called a danger he had not seen, and twice he shifted the whole labor of 40 men on her word without a moment's question, a duke taking his orders from his wife because she was right. They saved the bridge and the cottages, and near first light stood together on the sound bank, soaked and filthy and steaming in the cold, and watched the beaten water slide harmless past the piers they had held. Then Alaric turned. The flood was won, and he did not look at it. He looked at her, and for once he did not reach for the stillness he hid inside. He let her see the whole of it, the years and the grief and the thing that had no name, plain in his tired face, and she looked back, and did not spare either of them by looking away. Neither of them ever put a word to it, but it was said in the one tongue he wholly trusted, and a thing said in that tongue cannot be unsaid. She thought, climbing to the house in the gray wet dawn with his coat around her shoulders, that she had never been so tired or so near to happy in the whole of her life. It was the last easy hour she would have for a long while, for the ruin was already in motion, and it came as such ruin does from the one man with the most to lose. If a buried thing were ever turned up, Sir Osric Vane had prospered mightily in 7 years. He had bought a great house outside Marchmoor, and a knighthood to keep in it. He sat on boards and gave to hospitals, and was by every account that mattered, the finest man the town had ever made. He had built the whole of it on a dead builder's disgrace and a room full of graves, and he guarded it the way a man guards the single thing he cannot afford to lose. He had left the ruined daughter alone while she was nothing, for a nothing cannot hurt you. But the ruined daughter wed to the Duke of Wayland was another matter entirely. Vane knew, better than the gossips did, exactly who the Duke of Wayland was, the wild boy of 7 years gone, the one man living who had ever stood up in public and set Vane's name beside the word guilt. And now that man had taken Ansel's daughter under his roof in his name, and had been asking careful questions through careful lawyers for years. Vane did not need it spelled out for him. He moved to end it the way he did everything, smoothly, from behind, in a manner no one could ever lay at his door. He struck first at her name, because her name was the softest place to strike. A young woman of no birth, disgraced already, married in a hole-and-corner fashion to a duke no one understood, was a thing that wanted only the right voice to turn it from a scandal into a fraud. Vane let it be known, with sighs and a great show of reluctance, in all the right rooms, that the poor deluded duke had been imposed upon, that the Ansel creature was no true wife at all, but a schemer who had trapped a broken man, that she was, in the phrase that did the most work, and that the kindest thing for all concerned would be for the family to be rid of her before she dragged a great name down with her own. Inside a month, The thing had gone everywhere, and it did precisely the work it was built to do. Then Vane made certain of it. On a black night not long after, while the house slept, men came over the Fenwick wall who had no business there. They knew the one room they wanted. By morning, the locked working room stood open and black and reeking, its wall of drawings gone to ash, the ledgers burned, the letters burned, 7 patient years of it burned, and the iron castings, the broken proof, carried clean away into the dark. Nothing else in the house was touched. It was no robbery. It was a message and a clearing of the ground before the finish. Verity found her husband standing in the ruined room in the first gray light, quite still, looking at the ash. He did not rage. She almost wished he would. He looked a long time at the black wall where her father's drawings had hung, and at last he said, in a low, even voice worse than any shouting, that he had been careful, that he had believed himself so careful, and that carefulness, it seemed, had never once been enough, not 7 years ago and not now. And Verity understood that the thing they had waited 7 years for was gone in a single night, that Vane had chosen his moment on purpose, and that he meant to finish it in the open where the whole county could watch. For the great winter assembly at Marchmore stood 3 weeks off. Everyone would be there. And Sir Osric Vane meant the Duchess of Wayland to be unmade in the brightest room in the county, in the very town that had buried her father, with the one man who might have saved her stripped at last of the only weapon he had. She stood in the reek of the burned room beside her silent husband and felt the last of her hope go cold in her. And in that moment she made the only choice a proud woman who loves is left to make. She would not let him be destroyed a second time on her account. If her presence was the blade Vane meant to use, she would take herself out of his hand before he could lift it. But first, she would give her husband the one thing she had left to give him. And then she would go. She went to him that night in the estate office, where he sat among the smell of char with a single candle and did nothing, which she had never once seen him do. She had rehearsed it on the stairs, and said it plainly, for plainness was the only coin he prized. "You must let me leave," she said. "You know the thing they are saying, and who set it going, and why, and that a lie in that man's mouth is one no soul can answer, least of all now. In 3 weeks he means to finish me before the whole county, and to finish you and your sister with me. I will not be the blade. He does it with, I know now why you married me. Clemence has told me. I know of my father and your brother, and what you tried to do, and what it cost you. This was never a marriage. It was a debt, and you have settled it many times over, and I free you from the whole rest of it. Send me off, and let the talk follow me out the door, and keep your sister, her friends, and yourself your peace." She had to stop. Her voice would not hold. There was a silence, unlike his other silences. She watched him reach, out of 7 years of habit, for the pen and paper that had always stood between him and the saying of a hard thing. She watched his hand close on them, and she watched him take it away and leave them lying. He stood. He came around the burned end of the desk and stood close before her, so that she was looking up into his face, and she saw him wrestle a thing that no ink was going to wrestle for him this time. And the Duke of Wayland, who had not defended himself aloud to any living soul in 7 years, opened his mouth and spent his voice on her. "Verity," he said, only her name, hoarse and cracked from the long disuse of it, and it plainly cost him to the bone. Then, steadier, "You are not leaving this house, and you are not leaving me, and I am going to tell you why, though it is the hardest work I have done in 7 years. I let you believe it was a debt," he said, "because a debt was a weight I knew how to carry. I have carried everything as a debt for 7 years. It was easier than the truth. The truth is that it stopped being a debt in a room above our heads, one gray afternoon when you looked at my drawing and told me the stair was wrong and were right, and cared not one straw that I was a duke. I have been in love with my own wife ever since, and calling it a debt, because the debt was safe and the other thing was not. He drew a breath that shook. I told myself for 7 years that my silence was good sense, that a man whose word once helped ruin his friend had no right to trust that word again. I have learned this year the one thing worse than a truth that wounds. It is a truth that could heal, shut in a drawer because the speaking of it frightens you, and the name you give that fear to live with is caution. I buried what I knew of your father for 2 whole years and called it sparing you. It was not sparing you. It was fear in a good coat, and I am done wearing it. Vane will not have you. I mean to stop him, and I mean to stop him by the one means I have denied myself for 7 years, which is allowed, in front of the whole of them, in the very place the wrong was first done. Verity stood in the char and the candlelight and could not. She who had done all the talking that year find a single word. And then she found the only one that counted. There is a thing I have never told you, she said. Never told anyone. I have carried it since I was 17. She felt it come up out of her like a stone rolled off a grave. I was at the gallery the week before it opened. I went with my father as I always did. And one evening near dark I saw a cart come in late with iron, and I saw the foreman turn my father's inspector away from the door, and I saw them set the new castings in the place of the good ones already passed. And I saw the man who stood in the yard and gave the orders and paid the foreman to keep his mouth shut. It was Vane. I have known his face for 7 years. I was a frightened girl, and then a disgraced one, and no soul alive would have taken the word of Ansel's daughter against Sir Osric Vane, so I said nothing, and it has rotted in me since. You have spent 7 years hunting the proof that stood in that yard the whole time, in me. For a moment Alaric did not move at all. Then he took her face in both his hands, as carefully as he set the first course of a wall, and told her, in the rough new voice he was relearning for her sake, that she was going nowhere, that they would go to Marchmore together, and that Sir Osric Vane had made a single mistake in 7 careful years. He had burned the paper. He had not been able to burn the 2 people who knew. The great assembly at Marchmore filled the brightest rooms in the county, as it did every winter, and that winter it filled them with people who had come to watch a Duchess destroyed. They had the story off by heart, and Sir Osric Vane moved among them like a slow tide, gracious and sorrowful, letting fall his little sighs over the poor deluded Duke and the schemer who had snared him, and the room drank it down and was glad. When Verity came in on Lady Clemence's arm in plain grey silk, the room did the thing it had gathered to do. It drew back from her. A cold ring of empty floor opened around her by the far windows. 100 faces turned to enjoy it, and somewhere near the card tables, a voice said softly, so that the whole room might hear it, and no one need own it, "You are no Duchess." And the Duke of Wayland was not in the room. Everyone had marked his absence, and it was the sweetest part of the evening to them. The silent Duke, who never answered anything, who could no sooner cross a floor to defend his wife than sprout wings and fly, had left her to walk into the fire alone. Vane had built the whole of his night upon that one certainty, the safest wager in the county, that the Duke of Wayland would sooner die than open his mouth. Verity stood straight in her ring of cold floor and held her father's little brass weight tight inside her glove and waited to be finished. Then something shifted at the far doors, a turning of heads, a dying of the noise, and the crowd near the entrance parted, and the Duke of Wayland came into the room. He did not stop to greet his hosts. He did not go to his sister. He walked the length of that bright floor, past the great and the titled and the gracious, past every noble who had turned a shoulder to his wife, and the cold ring of empty space opened around Verity to shame her. He walked straight into, and stopped at her side, and turned and set himself between her and the room. It was the plainest act in the world, and it silenced those rooms more completely than any shout could have. He had answered nothing with words, yet he had only crossed a floor and stood beside his wife. And every soul present understood, in the doing of it, that the story they had come to enjoy was not going to happen. Then he spoke, and the rough, unused voice of him carried into a silence gone suddenly, total. "I have not spoken in a room like this in 7 years," he said. "You are owed no apology for the silence, though you may have one for the clumsiness, being badly out of the way of it. You have spent those 7 years deciding among yourselves what my silence meant. Pride, some of you said. Guilt, said others. A madness in the family. I will spare you the trouble of guessing any further, because I have found something at last that is worth the breaking of it, and because a truth of this kind belongs spoken, where the wrong was done, and not murmured safe at home. Some of you in this room helped to do the wrong. 7 years ago this county broke an innocent man and buried him for a thing he never did, he said. His name was Elias Ansel, and some of you cheered when he fell. He built the gallery whose fall, you remember, and he built it true. He did not cheat the iron. The iron that failed was not the iron he drew, and he did not put it there. I know it, because I stood in the wreck of that gallery with my own dead brother not yet carried out, and looked at the broken castings with my own eyes, and saw they had been changed. And I stood up, and said so, and named the man I believed had changed them. And you laughed, or you pitied me, and turned my own words into another nail in an innocent man's coffin. I learned that night what a word of mine was worth in such a room, so I stopped spending them. And for 7 years did the patient work instead, gathering in the dark the proof I had lacked as a boy. A stir ran through the room. His eyes found Vane, standing very still now among his admirers. "The man who supplied the iron for that gallery," said the Duke, "and swapped good castings for cheap ones to line his pocket, and forged Elias Ansel's orders to carry the blame, and let a room full of people come to harm sooner than lose his profit, was Sir Osric Vane." He let the name stand in the silence. "I have been near to certain of it for 2 years," he said, "but I had learned, at the cost of an innocent life, what happens when a man accuses the powerful and falls short of his proof. I would not do to the daughter what my haste once did to the father. So I waited and gathered and made certain, and waited too long, for not 3 weeks past Sir Osric Vane sent men over my wall by night and burned the most of what I had. He believed that ended it. He looked for the first time at the packed and silent room all around him. But a careful man keeps his proof in more than one place, and Vane's fire reached only the copies nearest to hand. And there is one proof no fire reaches and no wall keeps out. And for all his care, Vane forgot it. He forgot there was a witness. And the Duke of Wayland stepped a little aside, so the room could see the woman he had crossed it to reach, and said, "My wife has something to say to you, and I will thank every soul here to give the Duchess of Wayland the courtesy of silence while she says it." Verity looked out at the sea of faces that had come to break her. She thought of Elias Ansel. She felt his plum bob hanging true in her palm. She let go of the last of her fear, and she spoke, clear and steady, into the most complete silence of her life. "I was there," she said. "I was 17. I went with my father to the gallery the week it was to open, and with my own eyes. In the yard, at dusk, I watched Sir Osric Vane turn away the inspector and set his cheap iron in the place of the good, and pay the foreman to hold his tongue. I have carried it 7 years, too frightened and too disgraced to think I would be believed. I am not frightened now. My father built that gallery true. That man unbuilt it for money, and let it fall, and let my father take the blame for it. I saw him do it. A hush worse than any uproar came down over the brightest rooms in the county. No one laughed and no one sighed, and the gracious murmur that had carried Sir Osric Vane the length of his risen life simply stopped, all at once, as though a hand had closed over the throat of the room. He stood alone in the middle of it. The dead builder he had climbed over was standing up again in a duke's plain words and a girl's clear voice, in front of everyone whose good opinion was all that Vane owned, and there was nothing left to say, and no soft way to say it. For one breath he was not the finest man the town had made. He was only a man who had let a room full of people come to harm for money and ruined another man for it. Found out at the last. Then he turned and walked from the room, and the same bright crowd that had made a cold ring around Verity an hour before made a wider one around him now, and did not close it up again behind him. The undoing of the lie took longer than the telling of it. It was done not in one blazing public hour, but in the slow gray machinery of the law, over months, with clerks and affidavits and the weight of a great name behind it. In the end, there came a paper, flat and cold in its wording, that set down that Elias Ansel had been falsely charged, that no fault had ever been his, and that his name came back to him whole, and to his daughter after him. Sir Osric Vane, by then, had gone from the county ahead of the officers, and those lost at the gallery had the true wrongdoer named over them at last. She read it through in the library at Fenwick, at the gray hour that was theirs now, with her husband beside her. When she came to the end of the flat, cold words, she found she was crying in the deep, helpless way she had forbidden herself in the worst of the bad years, and half forgotten she still could. Alaric did not write her anything, and did not go still, and shut the way the old habit would have had him. He only drew her in and held her while she cried it out, and said not a word, and it was the truest quiet the two of them had ever kept. "He never saw this," she said when her voice came back to her. "That is the stone I cannot get past. You have handed him back his name, and there is no him to take it." He went to his grave certain he had failed, that all his honest years had come to nothing, that he had left me a ruined name, and not one soul at his back, but a daughter whose word counted for less than nothing. One other was at his back, Alaric said, and your father knew it before the end. She looked at him. "It was the thing Clemence could not tell you," he said, "because I never told her. The fortnight I went missing, after we buried Kit, before I stood up at the inquiry and ruined myself, I did not spend gathering my nerve. I spent it in Marchmore. I went to your father. Verity could not move. He was a ruined man by then, and dying, though the dying took 2 more winters. I was a stranger to him with no proof, no standing, nothing to bring him but words, and I had learned already that week what my words were worth. But I went to him all the same. I sat in his cold parlor and told him I had stood in the wreck and seen the truth of the iron with my own eyes, that I knew he had not done it, that I believed him wholly, and that I would not rest as long as I lived until it was proven and his name given back, however many years it took. He was quiet a moment. I had nothing to bring him but my word, and my word was the one thing the world had just finished teaching me was worthless. But it was all I had, so I gave it, and he took my hand, Verity, and thanked me, and said he had begun to fear no living person believed him, and that he could bear the rest now that he knew one man did. It was not his name, it was not his life. I could not give him those, but he did not die believing himself alone. That handclasp was the last honest hope I spoke aloud, and after it I went quiet until the afternoon. A builder's daughter stood in my library and told me my stare would not take the traffic. "What?" she whispered. "He spoke of you," Alaric said. At the end of that hour he told me he had a daughter, the truest thing he had ever made, truer than any wall he ever raised, and that his one prayer was that the world would not break her for what it had done to him. I could not keep that prayer while he lived. I was too busy failing, but I never forgot it. And when I learned, years on, that his daughter had been thrown on the world and shut out at every door, I did the one thing I knew how to do for a man I had failed. I kept his prayer. I married you to put my name between you and the world because it was the strongest wall I owned, and I told myself it was a debt, so I need not tell myself it was anything more. Your father asked me to see that you were not broken. Instead, you have gone and mended me. He would think that a fine joke. I believe he would have liked you a great deal." Verity wept again, and this time it was not grief. When the worst of that winter's business was long behind them, he came to her one gray morning in the library, and did a thing that surprised her. He told her she was free. "Your name is your own again," he said. "Your father's name is clean. Every door once shut to you stands open now, and would fall over itself to have you. You are the Duchess of Wayland, and no soul will dare say otherwise again. You have the whole world back that was taken from you, a fortune of your own in the settlements, and not one debt to me or anyone alive. I set all that in place first, on purpose, so what I say next comes to you clean." He was not an easy speaker even now, and she saw what the words cost him. "I married you behind a wall of reasons," he said. "A debt, a promise, a name to lend. You never chose me. You were cornered into me by a cold room and an empty purse, the way you were cornered into everything. Then I have taken the corner away. There is no debt now, no need, nowhere you are obliged to be. So I can ask the thing I had no right to ask while you still needed me. Stay. Not as the wife I hurried into a hole and corner wedding, not because you have nowhere else to go. Stay, because you would sooner be here than anywhere in the wide world you are now free to go. Be my wife over again, and this time let it be your choosing, and not your cage. I have found there is only one person alive I can bear to spend words on, and she is standing in front of me, and I have the hoard of 7 silent years to spend on her." And Verity Ansell, who had come to Fenwick with all she owned in one small trunk and no future in the world, stood in the gray library light and made the first wholly free choice she had been offered in 7 years, wanting for nothing she did not already hold, and choosing him for no cause but that she chose. "I have kept every true thing you ever handed me," she said. "That scrap about Mrs. Harkness is in the drawer of my dressing table with the rest, and until tonight I could not have told you why I hoarded them. I think some part of me settled on you long before you gave me leave to." And she lifted her hand and said it, for the first time in the whole of their strange marriage, against the hard quiet of his cheek. "Yes," she said, "I will stay, and I will stay, because I choose it." She fell still a moment. "You handed my name back to me," she said, "but you gave me a thing I needed more than any name, and you gave it first, and without a syllable. That first evening when I came here with one trunk and no hope, there was a fire already lit for me and a drawing board set in the best of the light. For a stranger, you owed nothing and could not yet have cared for. It was proof that a person might do a good turn and mean nothing by it, but the turn itself. I had stopped believing such a thing was left in the world. That was the worst of all I lost in those years, worse by far than the name. And you handed it back to me with a warm hearth and one true straight line before you knew the first thing about me. So it is not only the man who crossed that terrible room tonight that I am choosing, though I will be proud of him until I die. It is the man who mends what is broken and slips off before anyone can thank him. It is the man who lit the fire. They were married a second time at Fenwick in the early summer, with no more fuss than a country wedding, for neither of them could see the sense of a grand one. Lady Clemens sat in the front pew, wearing the look of a woman watching a scheme of her own come off to plan, and she maintained ever after into a great age that the whole match had been substantially her doing. The doors once barred to the builder's daughter swung wide now. Everyone, some eager and some sheepish, their owners received and, more or less, forgiven. Verity found she had small appetite for them, having learned precisely what such doors were worth, which was not much. There was one custom of the long good years that no stranger to the story understood. Each morning, at that same gray hour, the Duke and Duchess of Wayland sat side by side in the library, while the light came up, and as often as not, said nothing at all. It was not the locked silence of his 7 ruined years, but the opposite, a full and easy quiet, the kind that settles between two people who have said what mattered and are glad to let the morning hold the rest. He came back to speech by inches over the years, and his voice kept always a certain roughness, for a voice put away 7 years is never the same when you take it out again. He never became a talkative man and had no wish to. But he grew into one who could, when it counted, say the one true thing to the one person it was meant for, which was all she had ever asked of him, and more than the world had thought him good for. The county that had once called his quiet a madness came in time to prize his few dry words above other men's long ones, the way people learn a thing's worth only once it can be taken away. On the library wall at Fenwick, in a frame set among the books, there hung for the rest of her life a thing that puzzled every guest who did not know the tale. It was no painting and no charter. It was a small, worn brass plumb bob on a length of old line, the last tool of a disgraced country builder. The one thing his daughter had carried through every cold room of her ruin, that had never once hung anything but true. Beside it, she framed the first thing her husband ever set down for her that was truly his, and not a summons or a bargain, a scrap of good paper, in a precise upright hand that said a slandering woman was not worth her trouble, and that he was grateful. Guests were forever puzzled that a Duchess should hang a workman's cheap tool in a torn half-note where other houses hung their ancestors. Verity never explained it. She knew every respectable house had once shut its door in her face. A whole bright county had once stood in a ring around her, and told her she was no Duchess, and every one of them had been right by the only measure they owned, which measured nothing that mattered. And one silent man who owed the world not a single word and had long since stopped giving it any, had crossed a crowded room without a sound, and simply stood at her side, and only then, when the standing was done, had he opened his mouth. She had her name in the end, and her father's with it, and a love she had never once thought to be given. But the first gift, and the one she chose to frame, had come to her true and wordless on the worst night of her life, from a man the world had called a monster for keeping quiet, and it had asked her for nothing at all in return. Everything she had, in the end, had begun the same way, with a good turn done in silence and no word spoken, and that, she thought, was exactly as it should be. The man she loved had always said the truest things with his hands, long before he ever found them with his mouth.